Okay, we are joined here today by Devin Connolly. He is an immigration attorney with Reeves Immigration Law Group based in California. Thanks, Devin, for being here.
My pleasure, Allie. Thank you so much for having me.
Hopefully sunny California is treating you well.
It is indeed another beautiful winter day here in Los
Oh, yeah.
Angeles.
But I know you've been busy. I know that just over the last couple of days, you guys have seen a lot of things kind of come into play. And one of those things specifically is some legislation that was introduced on Thursday. Devin, can you kind of go over that legislation? I know right now the idea is to eventually have that be sweeping legislation. Talk about that what's going on in the courts right now.
Yeah, this is actually, it's pretty interesting and it's pretty exciting. There's always been concern on the part of immigration advocates because right now the immigration courts are under the executive branch. They're a part of the United States Department of Justice, which is obviously part of the executive branch. So there was this legislation introduced on Thursday, I think it was, by Representative Zoe Lofgren, and she wants to make the immigration courts independent. She wants to take them out of the executive branch and make them independent courts similar to tax courts and bankruptcy courts. And what's interesting about it is the problem that a lot of people think we have with immigration courts right now is that since they're under the executive branch, there's not a lot of consistency. And a lot of people question the fairness of it all because presidential administrations change. And now all of a sudden the court decisions are being shifted based on who the president is, because the president's using the courts to try and shape their immigration agenda.
Okay, so that would be the benefit, I guess, would be to separate it so that every 4 years or every administration, we're not kind of backpedaling or trying to play catch up.
Exactly. There's not going to be these huge swings in immigration court decisions based on who the president is. And I can give you a perfect example if you want. When President Obama several years ago was in office, they really introduced what's called prosecutorial discretion. And with prosecutorial discretion, or PD, they were temporarily closing a lot of cases in immigration court. And when I say closing, the purpose of this was that we cannot deport everybody who's in the US unlawfully. We know that. We don't have the immigration judges, we don't have the ICE officers, we don't have the logistics to do it. So President Obama's thought was, well, let's close some of the lower level cases. If you're not a danger to society, if you're not a criminal, there are certain people who we should not use our limited resources. So we were closing those cases based on prosecutorial discretion. Well, all of a sudden, President Trump comes in and he eliminated PD. So nobody's immigration court cases was getting closed. We were trying to deport as many people as possible. Trump's out of office. Biden is coming back. PD is back. And now people are trying to get immigration court cases closed again. So it's just an example of something that's gone back and forth because subject to the whims of the president.
And I mean, that you talked about consistency, and that is a massive issue, Devin, that I've experienced along the border, talking to migrants, talking to law enforcement. I mean, half of the time, different sectors are deporting people from different countries based on arbitrary, decisions. There's no consistency. So how can we expect people attempting to come into our country to understand the laws or the policies that are in place?
Yeah, I don't think it's realistic for us to expect that. The messaging is always different based on presidential administrations. Now, I brought up like closing the court cases, but you bring up a great example as well, as far as border enforcement, as far as allowing people into the United States to apply for asylum, deporting as many people at the border as possible, referred to as expedited removal. There's just not consistency on an ongoing basis. And that's one of the big things that making the immigration courts independent would be able to address, hopefully.
So do you think that making these, do you think that would kind of have a trickle down? Because messaging is huge, right? We all talk, the migrants are all talking, the cartel and the coyotes are all talking, right?
Mhm.
So do you think streamlining that process, the messaging would start to become a little more clear, and that would not necessarily deter people from coming, but make the process just more clear, just the clarity aspect of it for them? Because again, some people heard that you can get $450,000 coming across the border, and that's still the messaging for some people. So do you think streamlining the courts would be a start for them to be able to kind of clarify the process?
I think it would have to help. I think it would have to help because, again, you go back to President Trump. I mean, he was very clear on his immigration priorities. Now, many people agree with him, many people disagree with him, and that's fine. But he was clear, and he was clear what he wanted. He wanted strict enforcement, especially at the border.
Mhm.
So all of a sudden, he's gone. President Biden is now in office. There's the question: well, do we have open borders? So you have a lot of migrants in Mexico and Central America who hear this rhetoric. Oh, President Biden wants open borders. So yeah, then you have people coming north and trying to enter the US.
Yeah.
Really difficult to separate fact from fiction sometimes with this.
Yeah, well, and unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but when President Biden was campaigning, we remember, I mean, everybody remembers the line he used with, "I want you to surge the border with your asylum cases." And so, that is the messaging that hasn't even, that's been a year. That's the messaging
Mhm.
that some of them are hearing. When I walked with the caravan, they literally had banners that said Joe Biden is for all. That was the messaging and still remains the messaging for a lot of these people. Even Catholic Charities of the Rio Grande Valley, Sister Norma Pimentel telling me that the messaging needs to be clearer. So aside from the courts, Devin, where can they really get a little more clarity on the messaging? Where do you think is another area that the administration needs to say, hey, this is what's going on right now?
Well, and I think the administration has tried to clean up some of their messaging as well. They've talked a lot about a more humanitarian approach,
Mhm.
allowing people to present themselves at the border and present a case for asylum, saying they're fearful of returning to their native country.
Now,
So
1 second there. Now, do you think that messaging is also getting across? Because it's easy to just say you're claiming asylum, even if you're not, right?
you can always say you're claiming asylum, but we have, in theory anyways, we have procedures in place to, ferret out those cases and summarily deport people who do not have valid claims.
Now with the manpower along the border, and you said, kind of theoretically, we have these things in place. Do you think that is something that's actually plausible, that somebody can go through all of these cases, and who can really determine whether someone's case is viable or not, other than an immigration attorney or judge?
It's really difficult. I mean, and to be candid, it's really difficult when you have the numbers of people arriving at the border. Now, people do have a legal right to apply for asylum, so I'm certainly not going to discourage from do that. In theory, and everything is a little bit different right now because of COVID. We could talk about how we are turning so many people away over the last 2 years or so. In general, though, when you present yourself either at a port of entry or you're detained at the border, you have an opportunity to apply for asylum, saying that either you've been persecuted in the past in your home country or you have a well-founded fear of future persecution. Basically, you're going to be harmed if you're forced to return. At that point, you see an asylum officer, somebody from U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, who is trained to ask the right questions, to listen to your statements, to review evidence, and those sorts of things. And they're supposed to determine in what's called a credible fear interview, do you have a significant possibility of potentially being eligible for asylum?
Now, at
If
what
so,
point
go
does
ahead.
that happen? At what point does that happen? Is that once they're in the US and that's their first meeting, or is that like at the border, they're having a powwow with someone who can determine if their claim allows them into the US?
You're doing it very soon after encountering an immigration officer, a Customs and Border Patrol officer. And that's, kind of the challenge thing, because you have this credible fear interview and the turnaround time is pretty quick. You're not necessarily prepared. You probably don't have great documents with you to support your claim. Maybe you have an immigration attorney, maybe you don't. So it's really difficult to get past that initial stage. If you do, however, and the immigration officer or the asylum officer determines you have credible fear, you're then allowed to enter the United States. You're sent to immigration court, and at that point, you have a full asylum hearing in which you can present your claim to an immigration judge.
Okay. Now you mentioned they can arrive at a port of entry and claim asylum, or if they're apprehended at the border. Now, what would be I have not seen a single person come and claim asylum at a port of entry since I've been covering this in 6 months. What would the reason be? I mean, and the thing is that's wild is I'll be watching people walk right across the river and you can hit the port of entry with a rock. What is the reason why they aren't self-surrendering at a port of entry, and why are they taking that risk? We know a 7-year-old Venezuelan girl drowned in the Rio trying to get across from Acuna into Del Rio. And so why not go to a port of entry?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of people are taking the risk because of the poor conditions in their home country. When you talk about, Mexico and Central America, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, whatever the country may be, there's a lack of jobs, there's a lack of opportunities, there's an inability to really support yourself and your family. So that's the reason to head north and come to the United States for work. I think a lot of people who are arriving in the United States and do eventually claim asylum are what people refer to as economic migrants. And they want to file for economic asylum. That's not really a legal basis for asylum.
Yeah.
There are limited grounds for claiming asylum, right? You are fearing that you feel that you will be harmed based on your race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or your political opinion. A lack of jobs, a lack of opportunities, that's not a sufficient grounds for asylum. So I think a lot of people are coming to the United States for work and to create a better life for themselves and their family, and they will claim asylum if they do come in contact with a border officer.
That's kind of been what I have seen and heard and witnessed from the migrants that I still keep in touch with. And a lot of them are, single adults that their family is back in one of the in Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, a lot of Venezuelans, a lot of their families are still there and they want to be here to work. And, there are some working visas out there. I know that our government just expanded about 22,000 for non-agricultural employers to be able to hire. But that's just not, let's be honest, that's not enough when you've got 1.74 million unique encounters at the border. And I'm going to throw out a statistic that's probably not correct, but 90% of the people I talk to are economic migrants. I've only really talked to, when I walked in a caravan of 5,000 people, encountered, a handful of people that are saying, we were police officers in Venezuela and we were being forced to work with the mafia and they were going to kill my whole family. Their story was very unique, but for the most part, they want to work. So what options are there, Devin, if at all, right now?
I'll tell you about the options in a minute, but if I can just say one thing based on what you said about coming to the US to work. And that's one of the things as an immigration attorney that has always frustrated me, because I work so closely with migrants whose dream is to come to the US. And I think there's a misconception out there that so many people are coming to the US for an easy life. That's just not true, because the overwhelming majority of my clients and people I interact with, they're coming to the US to try and seek a better life. There's a lack of jobs, there's a lack of opportunities in their home country. So they're coming to work. They're coming to make money and to send that money back home. Many of these people are they're voluntarily leaving their families. They have family members who die and they don't even get to go home for the funeral. They have to say goodbye on the phone. They're not making these sacrifices and these risks for an easy life. They're doing it because they feel as if they don't have any other choice. But I'm sorry, now to address your question.
Well, to go on that really quick, but don't they completely get put in a box and with their hands tied because they can't really work while they await asylum claims or while they're waiting? And so aren't they kind of forced to go into some kind of system or some kind of space where they need things? That's what blows my mind is if they want to be here to work, why can't they work? And then instead they're kind of forced to work under the table because they want to make a living. So that seems very counter, we kind of force them to need our government or need something. Do you have anything to say, or can you kind of clarify that a little bit? Because that's what, what I'm hearing, what I'm experiencing. We've got people that are lawyers in their home country and are here working under the table or willing to wash cars, because they don't want to rely on the system.
No, I completely agree with you. You're right. Yeah, I mean, they want to work and they want to support themselves. Historically, and this all changed, this changed a little bit in 2020, but historically, they could legally work while they pursued their application for asylum. You file an application for asylum, and it may take a few years to get through the system because of this huge backlog of cases we have in immigration court. So while your application for asylum was pending, you could get work authorization and you could legally work in the United States. And work authorization could get you a driver's license. It can get you a social security card. It can get you some other benefits. So historically, they could always work. Now, as a way to discourage asylum seekers, if you've entered the United States after, I think it was August 25th, 2020, you're no longer eligible for work authorization, even though you're pursuing the claim of asylum. So you are therefore, as you said, working under the table. A lot of people will take it though. A lot of people will take it because they figure it's still better than what they have back home.
Yeah, but I just feel like I mean, Alejandro Mayorkas even said himself, DHS secretary, back in September when we saw that surge of Haitian migrants in Del Rio, he said our immigration system is broken. I mean, that right there seems to be just, in a nutshell, part of the brokenness. You've got, a big majority of these people coming over want to work. They are so-called economic asylum seekers or whatever it is, but they cannot work legally while they're going through this. That seems very counterintuitive to what we're trying to do here, Devin.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing. I see articles every single day about how part of the reason why the American economy is suffering is because of a labor shortage. We cannot find enough people to fill these jobs, yet we're turning away everybody at the border. Now, I know there's other reasons for that, COVID and immigration policy and all those sorts of things, but going to your point that it's counterintuitive, we have people who are here trying to work and make a living. We need workers in this country. We know that. That's what all the economists are saying right now, but we're not allowing them to work. So there's a lot of conflicts there.
Yeah. Now, do you think that messaging is also something that needs some work? Because even when I was down in the caravan, one of the guys that I became friends with, his name is Victor, and he's like, we know you need us. We know you need us to work. They know. But then again, is the messaging getting convoluted and because when they get here, they can't really work. I mean, they have to do it illegally, which you're already coming across and self-surrendering, which isn't necessarily the process. We've kind of allowed it to be the current norm as of right now. But isn't that messaging, does that messaging need a little bit of work as well about what is available once you get into the US?
To be honest, Allie, I'm not sure how much that matters, to be candid, because the messaging could always use work. I think people are going to come regardless, though. I really do. I think the conditions in their home countries, it's something that they're not willing to tolerate anymore. The lack of opportunities, a generalized lack of safety, the crimes. I think that even if we do get the messaging across that you're not eligible to apply for asylum, there's not going to be jobs available for you legally, I still think there's going to be a lot of people coming to the US simply because they know they can work at, I think you mentioned a car wash earlier. They know they can work at a restaurant, or they know they're going to be able to find jobs where they're paid underneath the table. And that's still probably better than what they have at home.
But that's not legal, right? So how can we get a hold of that situation? Because we do know that back in September, I was talking with one Venezuelan family where they were living in Peru for quite a while, but they had family that had made it over and had set up jobs for them working in the hotel system in Las Vegas, right? So, but that's not the legal way to do it either. So how can we kind of start getting that in the right direction?
That's $1 billion question. We have said for years about comprehensive immigration reform. I started practicing immigration law in 2008. right around the time when Obama was elected, I guess. And I remember the person who hired me talked about how immigration reform is coming. All us lawyers who practice immigration law, we're gonna make so much money. We're gonna be retired in the next couple of years. It's coming. We know it is. Here we are, however many years later, 14 years later. So I'm still here. I'm still working. I'm still waiting for comprehensive immigration reform. We know we need it. And President Biden talked a lot about this. He talked a lot about this on the campaign trail. You need some sort of consensus amongst politicians between Republicans and Democrats.
Oh, hold your breath on that one, sir.
They cannot seem to agree on anything. And it's funny because going back to where we started this conversation about making the immigration courts independent, that issue has been around for several years. Both Republicans and Democrats have talked about it over the years. Now, do you think Republicans are going to come on board with it since it's part of the Biden administration and it's a Democratic idea? My guess would be no. There's talk about, the need to overhaul the system entirely. And we'll see what happens. Like you said, I'm not holding my breath on them, unfortunately.
Yeah. Now, you bring up, will Republicans kind of reach across the aisle, so to speak, or be on board with something under this administration? Let's go back to the policies that are in place. We've talked about Title 42. We've talked a little bit about Remain in Mexico, both policies that were put into place under the Trump administration that this current administration has actively tried to overturn and has openly said that. Because that doesn't necessarily fit their policies. So do you think that those policies need to be in place? Do you think that there's room to have those things overturned? Or what's your take on Title 42 and MPP?
Well, starting with Title 42, it's interesting. It was enacted for the first time ever, I believe, in March 2020, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. It is something like more than 1.5 million people, I think, have been turned around at the border without the ability to apply for asylum. I think the concern the presidential administration has is how do we deal with those people in a humanitarian way? Because, and I'll be honest, I am as concerned with COVID as anybody. I am always wearing my mask. I am cautious. I'm keeping my distance. I'm trying to take all the proper precautions. Do we want to allow a lot of people to come into the United States when impossible, they may, bring with them a communicable disease such as COVID? There's been talk about providing vaccinations to migrants at the border, about testing them. The concern the Biden administration had was that might just incentivize people to come to the US. If they knew they could come to the US and be vaccinated and allowed to pursue their case for asylum, then that might just be encouraging more people to try and enter the US and claim asylum.
Okay.
So I think that's kind of
expedited you wouldn't be able to remove them expeditiously if they are going to be vaccinated and tested willingly because they're following the rule, right?
Yeah, it almost eliminates even the need for Title 42 because they're no longer a public health threat, or significantly less if they're vaccinated and if they've been tested and those sorts of things.
So the Biden administration could do that if they want to, which would be kind of counter to what a lot of people think that the administration is doing, right? So I guess why aren't they then?
I think they chose not to because of the concern about incentivizing people to come, which would just make the numbers go even higher.
Okay. Gotcha. Now, speaking of the numbers, obviously you've been in this game for quite a while, sir. What are you hearing or what do you know about this, why we are seeing this unprecedented number? We know back in 2019, there was a big surge as well. We hit over 980,000 unique encounters at the border under the Trump administration. Now, that right now we have still just about doubled that. So what is the reason for this massive number? I know in the beginning it was a lot of Haitians and the Biden administration had said the earthquake, the presidential assassination, but a lot of those folks, and we know this, have been living in other countries before coming here. So why the surge now?
I have heard, and again, it's really difficult to separate fact from fictions, but I've heard that the number, I think the most recent number I saw was, 1.7 million contacts with Border Patrol officers in fiscal year 2021.
Mhm.
I've heard in a sense that number is a little bit artificially high because now that we are turning people away under Title 42, they are trying multiple times. Whereas when they were given an order of expedited removal in the past, they were not necessarily coming back over and over again. But now, if I try and enter the US and I'm turned away under Title 42, I could try again this afternoon, or I could try again tomorrow and next week, next month. All of a sudden, that's 5 times I've interacted with CBP,
Now, what's
and
a
it's just
unique
one
encounter
person.
then? Why do they call them unique encounters if they've seen them 5 times? Because that's what it says on Border Patrol's website, is they're unique encounters. So why would they be unique if they're the 5th time you've seen them?
That I don't have a good answer for.
Okay.
That, I'm sorry.
Now, I mean, even if we're nice about, I always try to shoot real low on things, right? Like let's play half. Half of 1.74 million is 870,000. That's still double what was in 2020, still double what was in 2018, 2017, basically every other year besides 2019 over the last 10 years. A normal year is about 450,000. So if we're even being kind and saying, let's cut 1.74 million in half and give it some grace, that number is still double than what we would see on an average year. So what are people telling you? What are migrants that are going through these cases telling you? Is it, now's the time, or, I can't really figure out the timing of this all.
Yeah, and I think it's probably a lot of things. I think part of it is the belief that migrants do have a better chance of entering the US. When you go back to Biden does not have the same policies as Trump. He's not taken as much of a hard line at the border. He wants to have more of a humanitarian approach. He wants the laws enforced, but he wants them to be on a more humanitarian level. So people are thinking they are going to be able to enter the US. The conditions in other countries outside the US are as bad as they've been in a long time, with the economies, with COVID, with crime. I think, and I'd have to double check this, but I believe we significantly cut aid to Central American countries over the last few years, making them even worse. So I think it's a lot of factors that really are all coming together
Okay.
all at once.
Now with the influx that we're seeing right now, and because this year we're already on track to beat last year, we've already surpassed years prior, right? We've already seen over 400,000 encounters this fiscal year, I believe is what we're looking at. So with that said, does that backlog the people that are waiting right now? Does that backlog like say you're an American citizen and you married a Mexican national, and you're waiting in the process. Does this influx of people and this influx of people claiming asylum or trying to get citizens or trying to be in our country temporarily or not, does it impact those waiting and that have been waiting?
Potentially, because in going back to immigration courts, one of the biggest problems we have with the immigration courts right now is just the backlog of cases. It's somewhere, I want to say, around 1.6 million cases pending right now, which is the most we've ever had. So there are a ton of cases in immigration court, and a lack of immigration judges, a lack of court facilities.
Now,
So
do you know how many of those are people crossing and how many of those are like American units, family units waiting?
I don't know if that data is available, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't either.
Yeah.
Gotta ask, didn't know if you had a database I don't have over here, Devin.
But there's so many cases that there's already a backlog. Anytime there's anybody in the US who's applying for immigration benefits or sent to immigration court, whatever the case may be, you just add another person into the system, and you have a lack of judges, you have a lack of immigration officers from US Citizenship and Immigration Services. Everything is going slower with COVID. They were shut down for a little while and they weren't conducting interviews or court hearings, so everything got pushed back. So yeah, the more people applying for benefits or the more people in deportation proceedings, it just slows everything down.
Yeah. And I mean, it's got to be frustrating for everyone involved, right? The people waiting to be able to work, the people waiting to be able to be reunited with their family on either side of the border, whatever that might look like. I would imagine that causes some frustration. What do you hear from people waiting? I mean, and I guess how soon are their cases heard, or how soon do they hope their cases are heard? And what are you hearing?
A lot of frustration
Mm.
in all different areas. I mean, I have people who are permanent residents of the US. They have their green card. They are applying to become naturalized US citizens. And over the last, couple years or so, the applications have been taking so long when they're trying to become US citizens. I mean, this is completely separate and apart from an economic migrant in Title 42 at the border, but just the government processing times are so slow, and there's a ton of frustration. I have people in immigration court. They're facing deportation, but for instance, we think they have a valid claim and we think they're going to get their green card. But it takes years to go through this system.
Mm.
And they are just thinking like, my goodness, what is taking so long? How long do I have to have this hanging over my head? And it's just because you can't, it's always there. It's always an extra stressor in your life. So everything is taking a long time, and it's just massive frustration.
Yeah, I
And
bet.
we tell them we do what we can to help, but on some level, you just need to be patient as well, is what we always tell them.
So what are the options or opportunities for people coming over? And let's use asylum claims to start.
Mhm.
When they're going through the process. What are their options of viability? Is it a green card? Is it a temporary work visa? Like what are they offered / what's available to them when they come into the US?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. It really depends on how you come into the United States. If you, make a distinction here between entering the US legally with, say, a tourist visa or a work visa versus people who enter the US unlawfully. When you enter the US unlawfully, meaning you are not inspected and admitted by an officer, you have very limited options. You are in the US unlawfully, and you're not typically eligible for any sort of a work visa. You're not eligible to get your green card based on marriage. You just have such limited options when you enter the US legally. You can file an application for asylum, and that could potentially lead to a green card in the future. But overall, your options are significantly more limited. It's a lot different when you enter the US in a lawful fashion, like I said, with a tourist visa, a work visa, something along those lines, because then you may be eligible to work legally. You may be eligible for your green card based on marriage to a US citizen or based on petition from an employer. So it's significantly different.
Now, is self-surrendering, is that not lawful?
I don't see a lot of people who want to self-surrender, to be honest.
Well,
You mean at the border?
That's what everybody is doing, right? Like every migrant that's coming into the US right now is self-surrender. They're looking for Border Patrol and they are self-surrendering to Border Patrol. Is that lawful or unlawful?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought you were talking about self-surrendering once you're in the US, kind of like self-deport. So I'm sorry.
No, yeah, that's not something that we see a lot of either. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. There are a ton of people who are not necessarily trying to enter the US illegally. They are seeking out a port of entry. They are looking for a border officer to say, here I am, this is my name, this is where I'm from, this is why I want to claim asylum. I absolutely agree with you there. They are allowed in the United States, potentially. They may be allowed into the United States to, say, pursue a claim of asylum, but they still have really limited options once they're here. It's just our laws are not.
What would their options be versus someone who did the process differently or went to a port of entry? I know a lot of migrants don't go to a port of entry, in part because they get the ticket that kind of sends them back to Mexico to wait for their cases, depending on their claim. But I guess what are the opportunities that would be different from someone doing that versus someone self-surrendering to a border agent?
In those two instances, like self-surrendering to a border patrol agent and entering the US, illegally successfully, you have the same limited options. You
Okay.
do. because neither one of them had essentially a travel document issued from an embassy, right? Such as a tour, and I keep going back to a tourist visa or a work visa, something like that.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I've used this phrase and kind of term that it's kind of a slippery slope, because we are accepting kind of the self-surrender kind of as the norm right now, which there are other ways to come into the US. So, but right now that's the messaging too. You go and you look for the green, slash down the car, go to the guys in green and they'll help you. And that's what they all tell me. These guys were wonderful. They helped us. They, educated us, gave us medical care if we needed it. Is that something where we're creating that to be our new normal, I guess?
Well, we'll see how it shakes out long term. I do think there are a lot of people, like you said, who are self-surrendering. A lot of people don't feel as if they have any other options to enter the US lawfully. They may not have family members here who could petition them. They may not have a prospective employer in the US who could petition them for a work visa. So that may be their only option. And they think it's a viable option to meet with the border officer, explain the conditions in the home country, explain the lack of jobs, those sorts of things. So they are happy to do it. And they're really hoping that they get some sort of a friendly response.
And that is what I experienced and learned too while walking with the caravan. They were like, wait, can't we just do that? Isn't that what we're supposed to do? That is, what most of the migrants are learning or seeing. And that's what will continue until they do anything otherwise, I suppose, as far as the administration goes.
Yeah, I would assume so. I don't see any major changes happening in Mexico or Central America to keep people home based on my limited knowledge anyways. So the thought is that we do have a friendlier administration. We do have, people who are talking about a more humanitarian approach. Maybe this is a viable option, and it's something people are willing to try. That's for sure.
And like you said, a lot of them are leaving everything that they had to, and the phrase that I heard from them was, we're leaving nothing to try for something. The worst case scenario is we go back to nothing. So a lot of them, they're willing to take the risk, because worst case scenario, they go right back to where they were, which isn't America, right? But they kind of think we might as well try.
Yeah, in a sense, what do they have to lose, right? So they show up at the border, so somebody shows up at the border and they get ordered deported, or they get turned away. Well, they try again the next day. Worst case scenario, they go back home. They're right back where they started. It's a sense of desperation. It really is. And I understand, I see both sides of it.
It's important. And that's why why we have these conversations, is to be able to explore the different options, and also to be able to understand it maybe from a point of view that isn't our own, right? So when we're talking about people petitioning, maybe they don't have family members here, can we go into the concept of chain migration a little bit? And what is that? What does that look like? Is that something we're seeing right now? Is that something we're going to be seeing later? What is that?
Yeah, chain migration was a term that I don't think I ever heard it before the Trump administration. That seems like where it really seems to become popularized. But essentially what it is, we've always had family-based immigration. And a US citizen, for example, a US citizen can petition their spouse from, we'll say, Mexico. So a Mexican national gets to come in the United States, they get their green card, permanent resident status. They could thereafter, say, potentially petition their own minor children or their adult children. Once that Mexican national becomes a US citizen, they could petition their parents. So what I always thought was the negative way of looking at it is it started in our example with this one US citizen who petitioned his wife, we'll say. And now the wife, the native and citizen of Mexico, has petitioned her children, and she has petitioned her parents and other family members to come to the US.
Okay.
That's the whole concept of chain migration.
Okay.
We've always had it. We've always had it because people can petition family members. We've just never used that term
Okay.
to describe it.
Right, and that's definitely one that's being used a lot right now. What's the
Yeah.
I guess, what's the problem with that? Their families, so what's the problem?
Well, it depends who you ask. I think I personally, I don't see a huge problem with it, but I think the concern some people have is then there's more and more people coming. Then we have too much immigration. There's too many people coming to the United States from the outside. And a lot of people feel that, perhaps there's a loss of our sense of culture, our values, because America's changing so much. I think it's really misleading, though, when people just focus on chain migration, because the US government already caps the number of green cards we're going to give out every single year. It's limited based on family.
Do you know?
We limit the green cards based on family relationship and based on country.
Okay.
So there are backlogs, years long backlogs of who gets to come to the US. So if a US citizen petitions his spouse, that spouse is not bringing 50 people with her. She might be able to petition her children. She might eventually be able to petition her parents, and so forth and so on. So yeah, other additional family members will eventually get to come, but it's still limited and it's still over an extended period of time.
And
So I always thought that
they're going through a process as well in some kind of document, right?
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, and when you're petitioning the family member, you're not doing anything unlawful. You are filing a petition with USCIS. There's going to be a process at the embassy in the home country. It is a long, thorough legal process that everybody goes through.
Now, the flip side of that is the argument that that I've heard from some is that there isn't really that much of a legal process right now for anybody coming into the US. And can you I know you walked me through what it looks like when they have kind of their first hearing, but what are the legal processes that are either not being followed or that are in place right now that are being followed that these folks are up against as they go through this?
Yeah, when a person's in the United States, generally speaking, and there's always exceptions to this, but typically we cannot just pick somebody, even if a person is here unlawfully, we cannot just deport him immediately. We cannot just pick him up, put him on a bus and an airplane, and send him out of the US.
Which we did
even if
see
you're
in former administrations, we saw a little bit of that.
Even if you're in the US unlawfully, generally speaking, you are entitled to due process. Fancy way of saying you are entitled to your day in court. You show up for your first hearing in immigration court, and it's a really short, really simple hearing. You meet the immigration judge, you talk about how you are going to apply for relief in immigration court. On what legal basis do you think you're eligible for your green card? The immigration judge will give you an opportunity to find a lawyer if you don't already have one. You're not guaranteed legal counsel like you are in criminal court. You need to find and pay for an immigration lawyer on your own. The immigration judge will give you time to find a lawyer, to prepare your applications, to prepare your supporting documents. And then there's multiple hearings, usually over the course of several years.
Okay.
To submit the documents, to resolve any legal issues with opposing counsel, with the immigration judge, and then to ultimately have a trial where everybody testifies, you bring in witnesses, you review documents. So there is this whole due process element of it. And with the backlog in immigration court, these cases are taking years. I mean, they really are. You'll show up to the first hearing. Typically, the immigration judge will give you the next available date on their calendar. And their next available date may not be for 12 months away.
Okay, so when they say that people are getting an NTA with an OR, right, which is your notice to appear on your own recognizance, a lot of those are like a 30-day window. How are they making it? I mean, how are they making room, or how are these people able to see a judge within this amount of time? Or is it an ICE officer, or what is that? Are they making the process a little different so that they can get in? Because a lot of people I've talked to that, have been here less than a month, they're going to see somebody for court, in the next coming days, or they just did. So how is that possible if there's this huge backlog?
Yeah, an NTA obviously stands for notice to appear. That's how you officially start immigration immigration court proceedings, removal proceedings. A lot of the hearings, even if you have a time and dates pretty soon, a lot of times they are rescheduled. Even if they do squeeze you in right away, the next hearing is usually pushed back substantially. Just because the judges, there's limited judges, and they don't have the time and they don't have the space on their docket to hear all these cases right away. So even if you do get that initial hearing referred to as a master hearing, the subsequent hearings are going to take a significant period of time.
And in that first hearing, would they have the ruling that they're being removed, or would it be that doesn't come out in the first hearing, right? I would assume that's an assumption. You take that one.
Yeah, typically no, but it's funny you bring that up, because that's perhaps our clients, that's the thing they're most scared of. When I show up on my first day in court, am I going to be deported? Are there going to be ICE officers there waiting to put me in handcuffs and deport me? That's a very scary situation for our clients, for everybody. But the first hearing, generally speaking, is very short, very simple. When you look at the notice to appear, there's going to be some factual allegations, saying you are not a native citizen of the US. You are a native and citizen of the Philippines, for example. You entered the US on this date. So they'll lay out these factual allegations, and then they'll state what's called a charge of removability. Why are you subject to being deported from the US? And the judge wants the lawyer to really just address all of that. Are these factual allegations true? Yes, we admit them. And we concede our client is removable from the US, for example. And the judge wants to know, what are we applying for? What legal basis do we have for them to stay in the United States?
Okay. Now, how many of them can afford an attorney? Or is this something where I guess how many, most of them could hardly afford a plane ticket. They had to sell everything to get here. So how do they go through these proceedings and afford an attorney or representation?
It's really difficult for a lot of people. The truth is, if immigration court cases are complex, they're difficult and they're challenging. And if you don't have an experienced, knowledgeable immigration attorney, I don't have any statistics to back me up, but I got to say it is virtually impossible to win a case on your own. It's really difficult. I know there are low-cost options. People rely on family members for help. I think a lot of immigration attorneys are really passionate about what they do. In my office, for example, we really try and do what we can to help people. We really try and lower our fees, and we really try and give people a break, because we understand the difficult circumstances they have. But the truth is, we can only do so much. Anybody can only do so much. We have our own overhead. We have our own salaries to pay and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Now, I know that about 50% of people return for their first court hearing. Do you think that has something to do with, not just trying to skirt the law, but just not being able to have access to an attorney that can represent you?
I think there's a lot of people who, there's a lack of knowledge out there. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of people who don't necessarily understand how immigration court proceedings work. And why would they? They've never been through it. I certainly didn't know how it worked before I started practicing. So they may not show up because they haven't taken the time to meet with people. A lot of times, to be honest, they don't get the documents either. They don't get that NTA because they don't have a steady address. They don't understand they're supposed to notify the government when they move. Maybe they get it and they don't open it. There's a lot of different reasons why, unfortunately, sometimes people do skip their hearings.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, when it comes down to, like you said, a lot of them are scared there's an ICE officer that's going to be there and slap the cuffs on them and remove them. Now, from what I am told from Border Patrol and from ICE agents, is that these people, if they are denied, that they're expected to self-deport. Is that true?
Anytime a case is denied in immigration court, you generally have the right to file an appeal with the Board of Immigration Appeals. You have 30 days to file this notice of appeal, and then you get to go through the appellate process with the BIA, it's referred to. And that process might take an additional 2-3 years, however long it takes. You're allowed to stay in the United States while that appeal is pending.
Okay.
A limited number of people, not everybody. That first appeal is a matter of right. Everybody gets it. Some people might also be, if they lose, if their appeal is denied and they lose at the BIA stage, they might thereafter be able to appeal in federal court. And again, this could take years in which they're allowed to stay in the United States.
Okay.
I don't think
Is there a downside to that for the country or for them?
I don't see a ton of downside to them, to be honest, because they're still fighting their case.
Mhm.
Many times they're still working, they're still with
Are
friends,
they working
family.
under the table at this point, likely, or do they have a tax identification number? Do you know at that stage?
It depends on the type of case. But a lot of times people have already legally obtained a social security number, a tax ID. So sometimes they are allowed to legally work in the US while the case is on appeal.
Okay.
Sometimes they're working under the table.
How can you get, I guess this is an ignorant question because I've never had to apply for one because I'm naturalized, right? How do you get a social security number if you're not a citizen / if you're going through an immigration process?
Your work authorization, when you obtain work authorization, that will allow you to get or work permit, that will allow you to get a social security number.
How do you get work authorization going through this process?
Many times, not always, but many times while you have an application pending for a green card, which again could take years. And while you have that application pending, you are allowed to legally work in the US with a work permit.
Okay.
And, kind of the rationale behind that is, well, you're here, we're just taking years to decide your application. Let's allow you to work. Let's allow you to pay taxes. So you're not doing everything under the table, because then we know workers are taken advantage of, those sorts of things.
Do you think that's an opportunity that they can expand further? I mean, that's something that I've kind of been saying is if you're gonna have this kind of open door right now, which it is right now. I mean, it's hard to deny that right now we kind of have an open door policy when you see the amount of people that are coming in and having an opportunity to defend their reasoning for being here, right? So do you think that has an impact?
Well, I would love to see work authorization expanded. I think when people are forced to work underneath the table, they're taken advantage of. US workers are undercut and they're exploited because of the cheap foreign labor.
Hmm.
On the other hand, though, if we start doing that, then is that just going to increase the numbers of people coming to the US?
I
You-
It's not an
it-
easy solution, is it? Nothing is. I'm like, this seems like it would work, but
which is why we haven't had comprehensive immigration reform in decades. We just can't agree, and there's two sides to everything, so we just can't agree on what the best path forward is.
well, Devin, I've obviously taken at least an hour of your time. We've covered a myriad of issues. What else do you have that is a sticking point for you? What else are you hearing from your clients as kind of hurdles or things that are deterrents? Because really, I mean, a lot of them, like you said, they want to be here to work. They're trying to go through the process. They are availing themselves to go through some kind of legal proceeding. Not everyone's evading the law. So what are you seeing on that side?
Biggest issue we're seeing right now is what we touched on earlier, which is really the processing times. Depending on, we have a lot of clients who are in the Philippines and China and throughout Asia, and the embassies were closed for COVID restrictions. Certain countries had mandatory quarantines, and there is just such a backlog of cases. So we have so many clients who are outside the US. They're waiting for their interview at the US embassy. They just cannot wait to get here and be reunited with family. And, we're doing, at my office, we're doing what we can to expedite it, as I'm sure all immigration attorneys are. It's just a long, slow process at this time. It's just one more way in which COVID has really impacted all of our lives.
Rears its ugly head, right? So with
Indeed.
these families that they're linking up with, some of them are sponsors. Some people have asked me, and I don't know if you know the answer to this. I'm sorry to put you on the spot. How can people be a sponsor or, and get involved to help if they want? Because not all of them have family here. So what's the process there?
Yeah, and I'll be honest, I don't know a ton about this, but when you have unaccompanied minors, children arriving at the border without families, without their parents or with anybody, it's the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, I believe. They are able to provide or find a safe haven for the child, if so they're not necessarily in the government custody.
Mhm.
They'll put them with a sponsor who is sometimes a friend or a family member, who is then therefore responsible for the well-being of the child.
Okay.
As far as how to get involved, I'm sorry, I don't have great information
Okay.
for you on that.
Yeah, I think that's kind of through the NGOs. I think they kind of help line
Yeah.
up and help navigate that space, but I didn't know legally. I mean, it doesn't sound like there's a real legal process there.
No, and it creates other issues too, because what if that friend or family member who wants to care for this child, what if they're living in the US unlawfully? Are they going to be really excited to go voluntarily interact with immigration officers to pick up their nephew or family friend?
Oh,
So there's
okay.
concern on that part as well.
Yeah, and like we've said, this isn't a one size fits all. This isn't a paintbrush along the border. We've got this fixed. Comprehensive reform is absolutely complex, and these are human beings, their lives, and they just want a chance, it sounds like, for the most part.
Yeah, I think a lot of times, there's such heated rhetoric on both sides.
Mhm.
Everybody's really dug into their positions, and I think we forget sometimes that these really are human beings with human emotions and the same stresses and fears, and they miss their family and all those sorts of things. I think we sometimes forget that. That just kind of gets lost in the shuffle, sadly.
Mm. Well, that's why I'm talking with you, and that's why we're, trying to comprehensively cover these issues, because it is multifaceted. There are a lot of pieces here that are part of this big puzzle. And again, our nation is changing, but that's also a normal thing in processing and in life, right? So it just depends on where we go from here, I suppose.
Yeah, we'll see what happens in the next, days, weeks, months, and years. It'll be
Now,
exciting.
now, do you know what, with this legislation, with the immigration courts, do you know when that's going to be heard? Like, what are we waiting for? What are we looking at with that? Forgive me, I don't have a lot of legal knowledge on the process there.
We'll see. From what I'm hearing, and it's pretty new, but so we don't have a ton of information on it yet. But from what I've seen, there's already some pushback coming from, Republicans who they are concerned that if it becomes, courts like we will refer to as an Article 1 court, then it's subject to congressional funding. I think there's already concerns on other side, despite the fact that this has been a bipartisan issue in the past. I mean, this has been something that everybody has agreed on would be a good thing.
Hmm.
If it can get out of the House, we'll see what happens over on the Senate side. But with elections coming up in the next few months, I don't want to be too skeptical or too cynical, I should say, but I'm will be interested to see how much anybody can agree on in Washington.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, you seem really hopeful, Devin.
Apologies for the cynicism there.
No, I mean, it's the reality of this situation, really, no matter what happens, and I keep saying it, immigration, I don't know how it is, but it has become such a partisan issue. And really, it's been these human beings have been a political football for 40 years. They're being used as currency through all of this. There's criminal elements tied up in this now that people are taking advantage of. And at the end of the day, I just don't understand how it can be so partisan when it impacts so many of us.
And it's funny because it hasn't always been like that. We used to, you go back years and years. This was an issue. This was a debate where there was a lot of agreement. There was a lot more agreement on, the benefits of immigration. It's just in the last few years where I think we've really kind of, gone into our corners and dug in our heels.
Well, and the pendulum, I mean, swings so hard in either direction, right? It's like you said, the messaging every 4 or 8 years, you've got this side or you've got the wild opposite. I mean, like clearly the opposite. So, and that just can't I just don't see how that can work and be a benefit or advantage for anybody.
I think the pendulum swings is a great way to say it, because they are just going from one end of the spectrum to another. As you can see, there's a lot to there's a lot of, like you said, it's very, very multifaceted here.
Well, Devin, I appreciate your time, and I hope that when I have more questions, because it's inevitable, just like the inaction of our Congress is inevitable, that I'm going to need you again. Would you be willing to continue to stay in touch and be kind of a resource for us?
My pleasure, Allie. Anytime, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be heading back up to Washington State, so you enjoy the sunny weather in California for me.
I will indeed. Safe travels. I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you, sir. Be well. Take care.
Bye now.
Okay, bye-bye.